Welcome to Generous Theology. Chuck and Brock take a break from reading material today and talk about their own personal experiences in Christian life.
Just thinking out loud, Chuck, I thought we're talking about material here. I know you love to focus on the material and not yourself. I feel the same way as well. When we had those phone answering machine messages in the 80s and 90s, I always hated leaving messages on the answering machine because I didn't know what to say and I felt very self-conscious. And so it is the same thing here to talking about myself personally and my beliefs and why I have them and influences and those kinds of things. But having said that, maybe somebody has an interest. So I thought I would throw us into the deep end of discomfort by maybe just throwing something out there and just saying, Chuck, what's your story? Where do you come from? What's your theologically background and how did you come into Christianity and come to the place where you are now? And what are your influences? What are your major theologians? That kind of thing. Can I throw you in the deep water?
Sure, I can try to swim in that deep water. It's interesting. Sometimes people will talk about what's your testimony, and in most cases, or in many cases, people think of that as a conversion story, right? In my case, the testimony would be not my own personal conversion story, but rather a story of what came before me, a conversion story followed by covenant faithfulness, which I think sounds like a pretty good performed way to have a testimony. But in essence, my family, my immediate background, my parents grew up in somewhat different religious backgrounds. My father grew up in a family that when he was living, would have described as typical American pagan. And by that, what he meant was the family probably thought of themselves as Christians. He as a baby was baptized in a church. His father had been raised Roman Catholic, but in that family, typically what happened is the mothers or the women of the family were often involved in the church and the men of the family were not. And my grandfather was no different in that regard. He really was not. He married my grandmother, who was a Christmas, Easter Methodist. If they were lucky, they made it to church on Christmas and in Easter, and then maybe for things like baptisms, and that's about it. And then in my grandfather's case, because he marries this Methodist, he's not even raising his kids to be baptized as Catholics. And so he was put under discipline by the Catholic Church for not raising his kids as Catholics. And my grandparents really just went on in their typical religion. Wasn't that important to them. They thought of themselves as Christians, but it really was meaningless. But in the little town, they were in the suburbs of New York City, and in the area where my father and his three younger brothers, back in the early 60s, it was still a thing for people to send their kids at least to Sunday school. And grandmother, even though she had moved away from the area where she was still a member of a Methodist church, decided, hey, it's the thing to do to send your kids to Sunday school. And there was a little church nearby within walking distance, a little Orthodox Presbyterian church in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, that was within walking distance. And so she sent her boys to Sunday school there. And not really thinking much of it, the pastor of the church would occasionally talk to her about what she believed and those kinds of things, and encourage her and her husband to go to church more often. And at first that didn't happen. But when my dad's youngest brother was born, my grandmother decided that she needed to get him baptized, because that's just the thing that Americans of that era did. And so she went to this pastor and said, hey, will you baptize my youngest son? And he said no. And she was taken aback. What do you mean, no? What do you mean you won't baptize my son? And he says, as far as I can tell, you're not a Christian. I'm not going to baptize your child if the parents aren't Christian. And as you can imagine, really upset her. And her reaction to it, some people probably would have said, I'll forget that. I'll just go back down to my little town a ways and get the baby baptized there or whatever. But she was so upset by this that she decided she was going to prove to this Orthodox Presbyterian pastor that, yes, in fact, she was a Christian. And her way of doing that was to get a Bible and start reading through it and find all the things that she thought could prove to him that she was, in fact, a Christian. That led her to spend time in the Bible and to realize, oh, wait a minute. Not a Christian. And maybe there's some things I need to change. And oh my goodness, yes, I'm a sinner and I need to be forgiven and I need salvation. And basically it was through that she became a Christian. Over time, my grandfather also became convinced of that. In his case, there was a little more of a miraculous piece to it. He had been told by his doctor that he needed to stop smoking because he had very severe ulcers that came about during his service in World War II and were just continuing to get worse and worse. The doctor was telling him, if you don't quit smoking, you're not going to be able to eat food in a year or two down the road. You need to stop. And so my grandfather's his wife now was Christian. She was bugging him that he needed to become a Christian. So he decided to put God to the test. And he said, if I really need to change, if something really needs to change, he thought of himself as a Catholic, even though he, was under discipline and hadn't darkened the door of a Catholic church in probably more than a decade. He decided, well, if something needs to change, well, then God, do it. Help me with my ulcers. Help me to quit smoking. And lo and behold, he no longer felt the need to smoke and quit smoking and decided, whoa, I guess I told God that he needed to do this and he did it. So I guess I better obey. And so he became a Christian. And then as a result of that, my dad, who had been going to Sunday school there, and his brothers as well, became involved in a Reformed church and started learning the doctrines of grace and started learning the Westminster Catechism and those kinds of things. Now, my mom's story is a little bit different. She was raised in a Catholic family. She went to Catholic school. She was definitely a Christian. And in fact, in her family, she was known as the devout one. She would go to extra masses all the time. But part of the reason that she would go to all these extra masses is she felt herself the need to do more and more, because she really was already, as a child, was beginning to understand that what she was doing wasn't enough, that she couldn't save herself. And she kept trying to do more and more. In the course of then beginning to date my father, they started dating. They knew each other in high school, but they really started dating after my dad graduated from high school. They lived in the same town. And in the course of those discussions, and as they started becoming more serious about their dating, they met with a number of different pastors. They met the pastor of this little Orthodox Presbyterian church. They met with a couple of different Catholic priests. Interestingly, one of those Catholic priests, the one that actually had been my dad's father's priest before he became a Christian, after meeting with both my parents, he told my mother, look, the bishop wouldn't approve of this, but I believe that what you should do is convert to being Orthodox Presbyterian. I think you would fit in really well there. Even though the official doctrine of the church, and this was pre-Vatican II or right around the time of Vatican II, was that Protestants aren't saved. I don't know that I agree with that. And I think you would fit in really well there. And so you have my blessing. And that was enough for my mom, I think, to really overcome any qualms that she had. And so that was it. And about a year after they were married, I was born. By that time, they had moved to Connecticut, and their Orthodox Presbyterian pastor had said, there's no OPC churches in Connecticut, but there is this Christian Reformed church. Why don't you join that? And they did. And lo and behold, I was baptized at Avery Street Christian Reformed Church as an infant, and have been a member of the Christian Reformed Church, various congregations within it, for a long time. Another part of my background, though, gets into what happens next. We're part of the Christian Reformed Church, which, as you and others who are listening may know, is part of the Dutch Reformed tradition, the three forms of unity, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, the Canons of Dort. But my dad was really beginning to become even more interested in not only Reformed theology, but Reformed philosophy and education. He had been an engineer, and he decided that what he really wanted to do, he learned about this little college called Dort College that around 1970-71 had begun to dabble with the idea of starting a Reformed engineering program. And my dad applied for it. They turned him down. At the time, they actually decided not to start the engineering program at that time. But what the folks at Dort told him is that, look, this isn't going away. There is a need. There really are, at the time, there were no Reformed colleges that were teaching in engineering, and there really was only one Christian college, a Protestant Christian college, that had an engineering program, Laterno College down in Texas. And so they felt that there was really a need for it. And they told him, why don't you go become a teacher? Go get your teaching chops, because you're going to have to teach engineering. Be a science teacher. And by the way, it's really good that you're from New Jersey. Move back home to where you're from in New Jersey, because New Jersey had and still does, had a system where people who are working in the industry can teach in their area of expertise and get temporary licenses. So he was able to right away temporary teaching certificate while he worked on getting a master's in education to get on top of his degrees that he already had. And it was really through that he became really interested in a lot of the things that we've been talking about in our years of doing these discussions: philosophy, theology. Bavinck was at the time only available in Dutch, and he didn't read Dutch, so he didn't have those. But a lot of the theologians and philosophers who came out of that era, those were books that he had on his shelf, and books that I saw, and books that I would learn a little bit about. He was a big fan of Abraham Kuyper and Kuyper's view of serious sovereignty and those kinds of things. And so as a result, growing up, both when he was teaching at Eastern Christian schools in New Jersey, and then later when he did get hired 8 years later in 1979 to begin the engineering department at Dordt College, which is now Dordt University, I grew up hearing all of the stuff and really being immersed in it. And especially once moving to Iowa, eventually my mom also taught at Dordt. And so just being involved with all of their friends who were involved in Reformed academia, just hearing about this stuff, you're surrounded by it. And it was really that got me interested in what we're doing now, whether it was the typical story of you do your Sunday school, you do your catechism, you learn that stuff, go into Christian schools. I myself graduated from Dordt College, but then also even beyond that, after getting into my career as an attorney, just recognizing how important a lot of these issues are, that really led me to dive in even further into some of these things and look for opportunities to study more. And one of those opportunities was here in Classis, Wisconsin. Classis is the regional, the denomination has a synod, but below that there are regional entities, and that's the Classis. And our local Classis, Wisconsin was doing a leadership development network where they were encouraging people from around the state to get together and study more. And so I did that, and 3 years of that study enabled me to get licensed, even actually to preach in Classis, Wisconsin of the CRC, and then just continuing to be involved, and then discovering the work that you were doing and connecting with you when you were looking for people to study the Reformed Ethics by Bavinck when that first came out in English translation. I was just really excited about that, because now you had the confluence of the doctrinal and theological background, along with when you're studying ethics, obviously as a lawyer, that's an important part of what we do. And so it just really was a very ideal way to study this, and it kind of leads us to where we are today. I know it's a long story. It's maybe not the typical story of on such and such a day my life turned around, but I also think that it's what led me here, and I can see God's leading to this point.